oh, heavens above. Let me feel the love of American music.
We're not that great with the ladies.
Save me from a sin worse than Satan.
Edgy, angsty, and oh so catchy, pop punk was essential to youth in the early 2000s. Widely considered the golden age for the genre, 1999 to roughly 2006 saw an explosion in pop punk's rebellious mashup aesthetic and its serious impact on style. So without further ado, let's skate right into it. Background. To understand pop punk of the 2000s, we have to go back to the rise of the punk subculture in the mid-1970s. The punk ideology was often one of disenchantment with mainstream interests deemed unoriginal and over-commercialized in the 70s, and with seemingly oppressive and conformist social systems. They expressed feelings of alienation and typically advocated for anti-authority with loud, fast music and bold, unconventional fashion to shock the mainstream. I'll eventually cover this subculture more deeply in a video entirely on punk, but for now, it's important to note their strong opposition to selling out and their advocacy for DIY when it came to publishing their own music and media, particularly because of their often lower income status, and partly because of their emphasis on individuality. By the late 70s, a subcategory of punk was born. It combined the textures and fast tempos of punk rock with classic pop melodies and song structure, and was called pop punk. 1970s bands like the Ramones, the Buzzcocks, and the Descendants helped define the sound with fast punk chords, sweet harmonies, and adolescent anti-conformist lyrical themes. However, while these bands were popular in their own right, the genre didn't really gain mainstream success until the 90s, where punk bands like Green Day, who often played pop punk, were signed to major labels and had enormous commercial success. Popular platforms like K-Rock FM and the Warped Tour then began endorsing the pop punk genre, contributing to its commercial explosion in the late 90s, with more popular bands coming out like Blink-182, then in the early 2000s, bands like Sum 41, Simple Plan, and Good Charlotte. Meanwhile, Avril Lavigne's album Let Go was the biggest pop debut of 2002, certifying 7 times platinum in the United States and setting a precedence for the success of female-fronted pop-punk acts. Pop-punk could now be found everywhere, in mainstream 2000s music media like TRL, in brand endorsements, in teen movies, everywhere. This golden age of pop-punk was defined by catchy pop melodies and major record deal energy that merged with punk sentiments like angsty teen anthems of alienation, chaotic comedic antics designed for shock value, and streetwear aesthetics. This was largely welcomed by youth as the 90s and early 2000s had been dominated by the bubblegum pop of teen girl icons and boy bands. Pop punk sold itself as the alternative to this squeaky clean genre.
Maybe I have an attitude and I have a lot more edge to myself than a lot of other artists out there do.
It was just edgy enough to be cool and just mainstream enough to be safe for the average listener. And this sweet spot hit the teens of the 2000s hard. So let's get into what it looked like. Clothes. So we should first contextualize the style influences before getting into specific items. The pop punk style is the amalgamation of 3 periods: 70s and 80s punk, 90s skate punk, and 2000s celebrity culture. 70s and 80s punk fashion was designed to shock and interrupt the norm, often creating anti-fashion statements that challenged the excess and glamour found in many 70s styles like disco. I think it's super interesting to point out here that McBling took a lot of style cues from 70s disco, while pop punk, who was inspired by punk, also positioned itself as the alternative to McBling. The fashion cycle is real, guys. Anyway, punk's objective to offend and disrupt conventionality involved things like fabrics considered trashy, like PVC, reinterpretations of domestic objects like safety pins, bold unisex makeup, hair, and clothing that challenged gender norms, and so much more. A lot of this was defined by Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren, whose design gained attention when they were seen on the punk bands McLaren managed. Their clothes store was a meeting place for early members of the London punk scene, selling clothes that were often provocative through offensive symbols, nudity, and so on. However, pop punk also took inspiration from a punk subculture called skate punk. This genre arose in the 80s as skateboard culture meshed with punk music and became mainstream in the 90s with bands like The Offspring and NoFX. Their style was known to many pop punk artists who grew up in California, and so it soon made its way over to pop punk, especially as skateboard mania was just as big as pop punk mania in the early 2000s. Think Tony Hawk days. Skate punk style takes some inspiration from surfwear, as surf culture has always been beside skate culture, but mostly from California streetwear, which I'll be covering as we go along. And lastly, elements of celebrity culture were woven into pop punk because of its mass commercial appeal, and band members who eventually became stars in their own right. Things like brand endorsements, which were a big part of 2000 celebrity culture, and celebrities who adopted some style elements of pop punk even if they weren't in the genre due to its mainstream success. We'll see examples of this as we go along, but for now, let's get into specific items. Tops. There were two main top styles of pop punk, the tank and the t-shirt. The t-shirt was worn in three ways: over long-sleeve shirts, covered in graphics, or branded with a logo. Graphic tees have a long history in punk fashion of the 70s and 80s, however here they were usually adorned in political slogans or controversial imagery. This was replaced in pop punk with simple graphics for a more sanitized image. Branded t-shirts included surf brands from the skate punk influence, especially Hurley, who sometimes collaborated with Blink-182, and the logos of many pop punk artists who created their own fashion labels, such as Atticus, founded by Mark and Tom of Blink-182, famous Stars and Stripes of Travis Barker, and Joel and Benji Madden's label called Made. These branded tees represented the celebrity aspect of the aesthetic, as pop punk artists now had influence in the fashion world. Similarly, tank tops were also a broader trend of the 2000s, especially within pop celebrity culture, as I've spoken about in the McBling video. The tank top originated as a male undergarment, and so created an androgynous style for female pop punkers that was reminiscent of 70s punk's androgynous styles. Additionally, it was common for female pop punkers to wear black bras under the tank to add edge. Shorts and pants. Unquestionably, the most iconic short and pant of 2000s pop punk were the three-quarter pants, especially Dickies when combined with a branded tee, socks, and some form of sneaker. Dickies were founded in Texas in the 20s to sell denim overalls to farm and ranch hands, and then expanded to dress many areas of work such as construction, manufacturing, and automotive. By the 90s, the pant had been adopted by Hispanic people of Los Angeles, with baggy pants being a longtime favourite of their style going back to the zoot suit worn in the 30s and 40s. Californian Hispanic street fashion has also influenced skate style since the 70s, with both arising from the same area. In the 90s, this mixing went mainstream as skateboarders began to adopt the Hispanic Dickies and white sock combo, as did hip-hop styles, making the look a dominant component of Southern Californian streetwear. The style made its way back to the pop-punk look of the 2000s as a nod to their love of skate style, but it also makes sense for the broader punk ethic that subverted non-fashion clothing like workwear to make a statement against conformity. I will also point out that long diggy pants were also often worn in the aesthetic. Outerwear. Two items that were subverted in pop-punk fashion were vests and blazers. I've covered both these items in the hipster and preppy video, but essentially they take their history from proper gentleman's attire, especially for business wear. Punks in the 70s and 80s loved transforming these conventional items into statements of individuality and rebellion, covering them in badges of bands, political slogans, and so on. Not to mention, punk icon Johnny Rotten made oversized blazers extremely popular with punks. Skirts. Skirts were mostly seen in the mid-2000s as pop punk started to merge with emo and scene aesthetics, and thus it wasn't a super essential component, but they still made an impact. The main item was pleated or plaid miniskirts that were once associated with school uniforms, as covered in the preppy video, and were a typical style of many 80s punks, who wanted to subvert uniformity and therefore often customized the skirt to create a rebellious aesthetic. Pop punks also took inspiration from Harajuku punk style in the 2000s. While punk has been a subculture in Japan since the 70s, after a series of graphic novels called Nana were released in the 2000s, in which one character was a punk, Harajuku began combining punk styles with elements of kawaii, meaning cute. This included the incorporation of pleated skirts being a symbol of school youth and innocence, which also worked as a symbolic subversion of authority, to which Western pop punk loved. Accessories. Jewelry. Terry cloth sweatbands were arguably the most iconic jewelry item for the 2000s pop punks. While the item that was originally designed for athletes to wipe sweat off may seem like an odd choice for pop punks, punks of the mid-80s actually began to wear these items as statements of anti-fashion, often cutting the top off socks to achieve the look. Similarly, studded bracelets were big in the aesthetic as a remake of the iconic 70s and 80s punk studded jewelry. Long throughout history, studs have been used to protect those who wore them in harming those who came too close to them. Studs in punk clothes in the 70s and 80s therefore added a sense of anti-fashion and ferocity to their style. And lastly, there were black gel bracelets, worn highly stacked on the wrist or wrapped together. These bracelets were a mega trend of the 80s that lasted until the mid-90s. It's unclear if they were ever adopted in punk during the 80s, but either way they were super popular with 2000s pop punk, at least suiting the pop culture component of the aesthetic. These bands became so massive during the 2000s that they were the subject of an urban legend that teenagers were using them for a game, with different colours of the bracelet denoting an act of intimacy the teenager would have to engage in with someone who broke it. This was so widespread, the bands were often called fuck bands, and multiple schools across the world banned them. Ties.
These ties, I would have gotten made fun of if no one knew who Avril Lavigne was. We would have never been recognized punks with wearing our ties unless an artist like her stood up and said, "This is my style and the world has to know it."
Mainly thanks to Avril Lavigne, and also to Green Day, ties played a big part in pop punk styles. As I pointed out in the preppy video, ties are strongly associated with proper gentleman's attire. But since the 70s, punk would wear ties as a subversion of their original context and a statement against conformity. Socks. Tall striped socks were worn throughout the aesthetic, again inspired by another subversion of a school uniform item that was originally done by Harajuku street style. However, perhaps more iconically pop punk was the tube sock with dicky pants. The sock originally became a super popular part of athletic wear in the 60s as a technological marvel, being tube-shaped rather than foot-shaped and made of stretchy yarn, meaning it could be made in mass one-size-fits-all batches. However, skateboarding has long adopted the athletic sock too, which brought it into the 2000s pop punk style. Belts. Aside from studded belts, which were extremely popular as a recreation of 70s and 80s punk trends, cloth-web belts were also a massive part of the aesthetic. Historically being used in the armed forces, it was another example of a punk subversion of authoritarian fashion. Shoes. 2000s pop punk shoes included Converses, who were often worn by punks of the 70s and 80s, and Vans, which have been a part of skate culture since the 70s and were the biggest shoes in the skate world in the 90s, which made them perfect for the skate punk inspired aesthetic. It also didn't hurt that they sponsored the Warped Tour. One of the most popular versions of Vans in pop punk was the Slide-On, which originally gained international attention in 1982, being seen on Stoner Jeff in Fast Times at Richmond High. Pop punk also adopted the big and bulky early 2000s skate shoes, which were influenced by popular large basketball shoes of the time. Models like ADL were massive in the aesthetic, although they didn't really last past the mid-2000s, as skateboarders went off the style, largely due to their impracticality for the sport. Macbeth shoes by Tom from Blink-182 also had their moment, as an example of pop celebrity influence on the aesthetic. Interestingly, 70% of the entire footwear line was vegan, and this was way before veganism had a popular appeal. There were also Puma Clydes, which came out in the 70s as a signature shoe of Knicks superstar Walt Frazier, and exploded in the breakdancing boom in New York before once again becoming a 90s skate shoe, and thus naturally made their way to pop punk. Hair and beauty. Pop punk hair and beauty included bold expressions reminiscent of the punk era, and broader mainstream trends of the 2000s representing pop culture. For example, pop punk jet black hair mimics 80s punks who would often DIY their hair using food dye. Additionally, the bold, spiky hair look was drawn from punk styles of the 70s and 80s, who used the style as a statement of independence and to match their aesthetic of spiked jewelry. Mohawks were also styled by punks for the same reason, being a historic symbol of ferocity that they wanted to emulate. While it takes its name from the Mohawk Nation, who would often pluck their hair but leave smaller sections of hair, the hair left was usually square and on the crown of the head with 3 decorated braids. The term Mohawk came to be known as the hairstyle due mainly to the 1939 film Drums Along the Mohawk, who displayed Mohawk people with the style. Instead, it's more likely to have originated with the Pawnee Nation, but 16th century Ukrainian Cossacks would usually shave their head and leave a long strip of central hair to scare enemies. The pop punk look usually modified the style to a faux mohawk, which doesn't go past the peak of the head and involves no shaving. All of these styles were edgy, but without the commitment of a bold style, perfect for the pop version of punk. There are some examples of pop styles that made it into pop punk, such as side bangs, flat iron straight hair, mid-poofs, and streak-coloured hair. All mega trends of the 2000s. While bold makeup styles were a key identifier of punk, 2000s pop punk was more minimal, Unisex black eyeliner all around the eye was often seen in the aesthetic, and on male performers it was particularly smudged. This was honouring 70s and 80s punk somewhat, as unisex makeup was worn to rebel against gender expectations. Additionally, an iconic makeup trend of the aesthetic was black nail polish. It's been around since ancient China, but it took off in the Western canon in 70s glam rock, with figures like Freddie Mercury associating it with rock and roll and gender fluid expression. Goth and punk subcultures were also drawn to the colour, likely because of its non-conventionality. By the 2000s, its association with rebellious subcultures made it perfect for the pop-punk aesthetic. Other visual cues. Fabrics and motifs. A collection of fabrics and motifs were key identifiers of the aesthetic. To begin, there was mesh, which was adopted by pop-punk in many ways. The fabric has been popular since it was first developed in 1888 for men's shirts and undergarments, but exploded in popularity in the 80s, largely thanks to the fitness craze, as the fabric was used over and over again in sportswear due to its lightness and breathability. However, its sheerness also made it provocative, and it was thus adopted by punks in the 70s and 80s. Pinstripe could also be seen as an obvious subversion of a fabric typically known for business attire, going back well into the early 19th century, where it was believed to be first worn by bankers. And lastly, despite its crossover with the emo aesthetic, skulls were a key motif of the era. Skulls have been a part of subcultures like goth and punk since the 80s, and their association with hard subcultures made them a popular edgy symbol for the 2000s pop-punk aesthetic. The decline. Towards the mid-2000s, pop-punk became more diluted into other genres, such as emo and neon pop-punk, a combination of pop-punk and electronic music. This seemed to affect the popularity of the genre, as it now sounded dated against these new versions of mainstream rock, especially in the late 2000s when the radio was playing mostly dance pop. Some pop-punk artists who incorporated these new popular genres in their records, like Avril Lavigne's The Best Damn Thing, which was very poppy, and Good Charlotte's Good Morning Revival, which included a lot of dance songs, achieved success in the later 2000s. But for the most part, it was clear the golden age of pop-punk was well and truly over. And between then and now, there's some things about it that can be looked at more critically. I think it's fair to say that some females who embodied this aesthetic definitely represented some of the not like other girls trope. Take the lyrics of Avril Lavigne's Skater Boy or Girlfriend as a prime example of this.
Show off your belly, dance around with your background dancers, lip sync, whole deal thing. It was really popular for a long time. I'm not made up, and I'm not being told what to say and how to act.
However, the aesthetic across the board positioned itself as the alternative to everything popular at the time, making it the not like other genres genre. The problem with this is the putting down of mainstream interests for your own interests to be validated. And oh, the irony when you're one of the most mainstream genres of the decade. Another flaw I want to cover is the wide criticism the genre has received by punks. Accusing pop-punk artists of selling out and using punk elements but participating in the very consumerist culture it hated. I think it's important to note that a lot of punks did eventually become very commercial, but it's even more important to note that at the same time, a lot of punk adamantly remained DIY and underground, honouring their anti-capitalist ethic with a determination to change systems, and were often targeted by the police, media, and society for this subculture. Therefore, it does make sense that punks were mad. However, the other side to this is that the incredible success of pop-punk in the early 2000s seemed to make it a genre all on its own, rather than just a subcategory of punk. In fact, many artists who were grouped into the genre outwardly expressed that they were not punk and did not want to be punk.
I think that I'm just a rock chick, and I like to rock out. I like to throw shit around. I like to scream. I like to holler. I like to break things. I like to yell.
In this sense, pop-punk grew out of its big brother punk and into its own. And it has always been a force to be reckoned with. Even after it fell out of commercial popularity, it still continued to influence many huge mainstream artists in the 2010s, like 5 Seconds of Summer and Charli XCX, and later emo pop-punk trap rappers like Lil Peep, Lil Uzi Vert, and Juice WRLD. And we've of course just seen its recent revival through new TikTok stars and artists like Machine Gun Kelly, Yungblud, Olivia Rodrigo, Willow Smith, and returning stars like Avril Lavigne and Travis Barker, all revamping the genre for today's generation of pop-punkers. Pop-punk's continuous influence on music and style is a credit to its perfect mix of edge and sugary pop fun, and any revival owes a lot to the 2000s golden era, in its defiance of any particular genre and fundamental position in millennial youth culture. What do you think of the pop punk aesthetic? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.